Good evening and welcome to the library. Thank you for coming out tonight. My name is Mark Hudson. I'm the Adult Services Librarian here at Monroeville Public Library. And tonight we're very fortunate to have the former mayor of Monroeville, James Lomeo, who will be speaking about his new book, From the Ice to the Fire.
Thank you, Mark. Well, thank you for coming out. I appreciate it. First, I want to thank the Monroeville Public Library for holding this event. It's kind of them to do it for me, but they do it for authors and other events, so it's a wonderful asset we have in this community. So we should give a round of applause to the library for all the work they do for us in the community. And tonight we have a special treat. We were fortunate enough to ask our government channel TV 15 to come here and videotape this talk. So that was nice of them to come to this evening. They're a professional group, so maybe you can watch yourself on television in the next couple of weeks. Well, my name is Jim Lomeo. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a local attorney. I have my office here in Monroeville. We've been here since 1989. We have 3 daughters, my wife and I, Sue. A lot of you know Sue. And one of my daughters here this evening, Lucy. I decided to write a book because I'm interested in history, interested in politics. So at first, when I decided to write a book, I thought I'd write a book about mistrust in government, or how today we don't trust our elected officials as much as we should. Not in a bad sense, just how do they perform once they're elected. So I wrote a few pages, and to be frank, it was quite boring. Then I thought I would write something about how the system sometimes doesn't treat people fairly. And I tried to pick current events to make that story, and it just didn't click. So then one day I was thinking, I had remembered the story about my grandfather's problems with the Teamsters and the Pittsburgh political establishment. And I had heard this story ever since I was a little boy, but I always thought it was urban myth, because you know how stories get exaggerated. Well, as I was running for mayor in 2005, believe this or not, the reporter, who's a nice, we eventually became friends, but had called me up and said, because they were doing a background on me, and he said, well, what about your grandfather's problems with the union? And I had forgotten about the story. And he said, oh, yes. He said, there's 10 days in October where your grandfather was front page story about his fight with the Teamsters. So I think I did look up one article, but I really never followed through. Then in about 2011, I decided to maybe do more research on it as I was thinking about writing my political book. Well, this story became more interesting to me than a political book. And this story is 3 stories in one. I tried to put a little bit of history into it. I tried to explain the immigrant experience, because my grandfather was born in Sicily. And I tried to do it from his viewpoint, not my viewpoint, not today's viewpoints, but trying to determine from his viewpoint like how he would have thought. That was more of a challenge because I didn't know my grandfather. He had passed away in 1948. So everything I know about him, I learned through oral history, through my grandmother. My maternal grandparents were also Sicilian. I had known them, though. They had lived into their 90s and 80s. So I think I could step into my grandfather's shoes just based on the stories of my relatives. So that's what I decided to do. The climax of the story is his fight with the Teamsters. He had a little fruit store in McKeesport. It was called Roma's Fruit Market. He named it Roma because of Rome, even though he was from Sicily. But and he had the store since the 1920s, he did not like the name Roma because everyone called him Mr. Roma. They didn't realize that he named the store for the city. And even when I was young, because I grew up in McKeesport, the teachers would call me Jim Roma. And I said, well, my report card says Lomeo, and I can remember having an argument with a parent saying, well, your true name is Roma. I'm like, no, my true name's Lomeo. No, it's Roma, the store's name Roma. So that bothered him a little bit. The store wasn't very large. I mean, I can recall the store a little bit. Even though he had died in '48, my uncle had taken over the store, and so we would obviously shop at the store. But I don't remember it being much bigger than this room. If it was, it wasn't much bigger. And back in the 20s and 30s and 40s, there was no Walmart, Targets. They were all just little stores. There were fruit markets, grocery stores, butcher shops, pharmacies, toy stores. So that's what's different about our thoughts today as opposed to their thoughts back in the 40s and the 30s. He had the store since, he took over the store from his partner, which is part of the book. But I'll talk about the pinnacle first, and I'll work my way backward. In 1929, he takes the store over on his own. Has a store. It's not a great store. He has a small little house, but it's enough to provide for his family and his 3 children. The war is about to come to an end. His oldest son is in the Pacific Theater. Somehow, oral history, and I couldn't confirm it because no one ever told me, or through written history, obviously, verified history, I couldn't confirm it. But my other uncle, who was only 2 years younger, did not go to the war. He was 4F somehow, but he didn't seem to have any disabilities. So those two worked in the store. Around July or August of 1945, my grandfather, who had experience from the First World War as a soldier and as an Italian citizen, realized prices were going to go up once the war was over. And that usually happens in major conflicts because there's so much money in the economy, because all the countries are spending money for guns, trucks, bullets. So that causes inflation. He knew that, so while they still had their price and wage freeze on, because the U.S. government during the war, we had rationing. So they had prices were at a certain level, wages were at a certain level. In 1945, they didn't have refrigeration. So if you were going to store fruit for a time period, you had to put it in a warehouse that was refrigerated. The current Woolies block building in the Strip District, that was called the Federal Cold Storage. So that's where this takes place. Is in July or August of 1945, he bought about 1,900 crates, bushels of produce, mainly plums and peaches, because he figured to refrigerate them, the war was about to end, prices will go up. Being the good Sicilian he is, he figured he'd make a nice profit, life would be good. But it didn't work out that way. After the war ended, all the national unions went on strike. Teamsters went on strike, coal miners went on strike, steel workers went on strike, because prices were going up, but the companies didn't want to pay the higher wages. So U.S. Steel, those larger factories had to deal with the unions. Well, the Teamsters decided they wanted to also unionize the independent truck drivers. And I'm not sure, independent truck drivers are people who don't work for a company, but you can contract out with them and they'll drive your trucks for you. So they want to also unionize the local produce drivers also. So they did this since there were so many in the Pittsburgh area, they wanted to unionize all those truck drivers. But my grandfather said, now why should I do that? I work for myself. I'm not in the union. He wasn't opposed to the union, but said, there's no need for me to join. They wanted him to pay $13 initiation fee and a $2 annual fee. So, I mean, even compared to $2014, that doesn't sound like a lot of money. So I can only assume that it was something that bothered him, that he didn't want to join. Because if you were just looking at dollars and cents, I think you just pay them the money and just be done with it. Why go through the hassle? Well, he didn't do that. He decided that I'm not going to join, and no one can make me join. So when he takes his, after the war ended, when he takes his truck to go to the federal cold storage, the Teamsters said, we're not loading your truck. Because the workers at the warehouse, federal cold storage, were unionized. And they said, and they were Teamsters, and they said, we're not loading your truck. So, now remember, he had a lot of money invested. He wasn't a wealthy man, so buying 1,900 crates of produce was a lot of money for him. And they were perishable. He then hired an attorney who was also from McKeesport, and they petitioned the court to get a writ to get his produce out. A judge, by coincidence, and this is where the book comes in, was also from McKeesport. Too coincidental for me. I mean, because we know how was there a calendar clerk who assigned the case to a specific judge for a specific reason? I can't confirm that, but I know what my grandfather thought. And he would think, yes, because that's the oral history that I have. The first hearing, the judge says, well, why don't we just wait till, this was on a Friday, why don't we just wait till Monday to see if things calm down? His attorney said, but we have perishable produce. So they waited. Monday, he issued the writ. My grandfather and his son drive down, my uncle drive down. The union loaded some of the crates into the truck, but not all of them. They were stopped. So he had to go back to court again, and the judge would not issue the writ again for another 2 days, and he finally issued the writ. When he went down for the third time, that's when the union Teamsters surrounded his truck and threatened to push over his truck. Now there were, and this isn't for newspaper accounts, there were 6 city of Pittsburgh police officers there and 2 county sheriff deputies. No one stepped in. Fortunately, in a way for my grandfather, before he went to the store, went down to the strip district, he drove past the store. Remember, when in those times, they had to get up early in the morning, drive to the strip district, say at 4:35, load their trucks, come back to McKeesport, put it into the crates for sale by 7. So when the store opened at 7:30, he would be ready. He kept his store open with the shift of the mill, because the mill was just down the street from him. National Tubes was a large U.S. Steel plant in McKeesport. So he wanted to grab this 7, 3 o'clock, and 11 o'clock shifts. He drives past his store, and this is what he sees. He sees the union picketing his little store. So this is an actual photograph from October 1945 that the Pittsburgh Press, which is now the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, took of the store. So now he's really worried. So he goes home, gets his gun, and takes it with him. So when they surround his truck, he pulls out, he didn't pull the holster on his gun. He didn't pull the gun out of his holster, but he just pulled his sweater back and said, "Leave my truck alone." The one union steward stepped forward and said, "You can't shoot us all." He said, "You're right, but I'm going to shoot you." So they all backed up And my uncle was in a car. Well, my grandfather had the car, my uncle drove the truck. He said, let's load these crates as quick as we can and get out of here. So they did, and he told my uncle not to stop for any lights, for anybody from Pittsburgh to McKeesport, and that's what they did. His attorney called the city police, and they said, we can't help you. Called the McKeesport police, and they said, we're not helping you. And there's a quote in the paper where the chief of police of McKeesport said, this is 100% union town, and we're not going to help that blankety blank. And that's what they quoted. So you could think of the derogatory words that he said for a Sicilian immigrant. The only police officer that escorted him was the one officer from Drosberg. I don't know if you're familiar with Drosberg. It's a little, so it's small, it's like Pitcairn. It's a small community outside of McKeesport in between West Mifflin. He escorted them from the county airport down to the line in McKeesport. So when my grandfather gets to the store, the police chief is there and says, you're causing us problems, took his gun away. Oh. So he's almost went through a violent situation. Now he's worried about they're going to picket him even more now because he was going to draw his gun. Now he doesn't even have his gun. So that's the basis of the story. There's a lot more to it. I don't want to give it away because I want you to read it. But that started me thinking, well, how does a person like this become a person like this? Like, what happened? And of course, I'm biased because it's my grandfather. But the Pittsburgh Press and Pittsburgh Post-Gazette were the two major newspapers right until Pittsburgh, until 1922. 1992. They both wrote editorials about my grandfather's situation. So here's an illiterate Sicilian immigrant that's able to attract the editors of the two major papers in the city of Pittsburgh, which is a union town, saying this wasn't right. So it got me to wonder, how did this happen? Like, how did he develop this type of character conviction? So I decided then to try to trace his life as best I could. And it was difficult because he didn't leave any written material because he was illiterate, not only in English, but also in Italian. He had no education, so there's no writings. I can remember my father telling me that for him to sign his name, he had to hold his hand and sign Paul. They called him Paul Lomeo. Paul Lomeo. I had to do that for my mother's father, because again, he was in the same situation, and he had a fruit store in McKeesport also, but he didn't go through this, and he was Sicilian, so why did one do it and the other one didn't? So I tried to trace his life from the time he was born into the time of his death, and I did that all with oral history. So a lot of the early part is stories that I had heard as a child. Obviously, I couldn't confirm them. So for example, in the First World War, he's up in northern Italy fighting the Austrians. He goes in the Army hospital, goes to see his friend. His friend is being almost tortured by a French doctor. You have to know Italian history, especially Sicilian history. Sicilians do not like the French because of the history where the French controlled southern Italy, Naples on down, and they were not nice to the populace. And rumor has it that's how the mafia started in the 1500s, where the French soldier was being a little aggressive with a Sicilian woman. They decided to take a little revenge to protect the populace, vigilantes, supposedly good vigilantes at the time. And they would make to see if you were French or not, they would try to have you pronounce, and I can't pronounce it, but because the Sicilian dialect is not Italian. The Sicilian dialect is a mixture of Arabic, Spanish, Italian, Greek. You know the little chickpeas you get, like at Labriolas? But how did Yeah, so the French, I can't pronounce it either, but the French couldn't pronounce it. I think that's what it is, yes. So for some reason, the French couldn't pronounce it, and of course, any vigilante group that's not following the law is going to turn into a bad organization, and the mafia developed into what it has become. And in Sicilian life, it was a large part of their life. So I can remember growing up, and this is kind of silly, but when you're 10, 11, everyone thinks it's cool to be in the mafia. And every one of my friends would say, oh, my cousin's in the mafia, my uncle's in the mafia. I mean, Kingsport did have a reputation of running a lot of numbers, so I'm not sure that's the mafia, but I never said that because my maternal grandfather would say, like, they're bad people. I mean, they clamped down on you. They would, when he was in Sicily, and they preyed on the Italian immigrants because they could. They didn't prey on the natives, right? Because you'd go to the police. Well, you're used to listening to them, so you listen to them when you're in the old country. So when you come to the United States, you listen to them. So it's not a good organization, even though it's sometimes, TV, movies. Yeah, definitely. So they didn't like the French. So he thought the French doctor was hurting his friend, so he took a gun and shot the French doctor. So then he was going to get court-martialed because the French were the Italian allies. He runs into an attorney who also of Sicilian descent, but he's in the American Army. Well, he's there representing the United States. He wasn't in the Army. So that's what some of this I can't verify. This attorney helped him get out of the court-martial through some networking. Again, I'll leave that it's in the book. It's all oral history. I can't confirm it, but in Italy, no one, especially Sicily, no one follows the rules. That's why their governments, they've had probably 50 governments since the end of the war because no one follows the rules, no one follows the laws. It's who you know. It's a rule of men instead of a rule of law, which can be a problem, as you can see from their society. So I don't know if that affected him or not, how that affected him. That same attorney shows up later on the book and helps him out with his problem with the Teamsters. That attorney's wife, again, this is oral history, I can't confirm any of it, but this is all urban myth. So but to make the story interesting, I tried to confirm as much as I could based on the written information that I had. So after he can't get his fruit out, he decides to settle the case. And that's when the editorials came out from the Pittsburgh Press and the Post-Gazette saying it's not fair. Like, why did he have to do this? But as the one title was, what's the use? Like, you don't get any protection from the courts, from the police. They take your gun. What's the point? So of course he's going to give in. And the Pittsburgh Press said they call it price of faith. And at the end they said, they went through the whole problem and they said at the end, it cost him $13 and his faith. But the story that I heard was that his former partner in the store, his nickname was Mungeon Dorm, eat and sleep. Because he had the psychological disease where he would just fall asleep. Yeah, narcolepsy. So, of course, they didn't, I don't think, and it wasn't just my grandfather's nickname for him, but I think he gave it to him. But I'm sure he didn't understand. He just thought the guy was probably lazy. He didn't really understand it was a medical condition. So they called him Mungeon Dorm. Now, I'm not sure if they called him Mungeon Dorm to his face or not either, though. But I know him as Mungeon Dorm. But that brings me to my point is I really don't know who Mungeon Dorm was. I don't know his true name. And if I did know his true name, I wouldn't put it in the book. Because some of the names that I heard that I think might be true, well, they still have family members that probably live here. I don't know them, but they probably do. So I didn't think that was fair. So I changed the name. Some of the characters are composites of people I heard about. So they're more than like fictional characters, but just to give flavor to the story. And the only true names I used, not just because they were in the newspaper, because there were some names in the newspaper that I changed their names, but they're in my notes, and if you pulled up the October 1945 paper, you probably could see some of the names. And then my uncle, my great uncle, I guess it is, my father's brother, also had a little trouble in 1929. So some of those names I changed even though they're in the paper, because they're not public officials. But I kept the judge's name. I kept the union steward's name. I kept the police chief's name as quoted in the paper, because I thought that they should know that if they're a public official, they could be criticized for their actions in office. And I actually didn't think it was fair that if you take an oath, you should follow the rules, the law. Now, that doesn't mean that they didn't. It's a perspective that my grandfather had. And I tend to agree with him a little bit, but I also have a bias. So the attorney that he meets in 1918 is the attorney that's going to help him out with this. And so it shows you the people that you meet along your life are going to come back to you somehow. I mean, maybe not this directly. Exactly.
Yeah, we understand.
So after the Teamsters, after he decides to give in, Mungeon Dorm, the reason he gave in, though, is Mungeon Dorm told him, if you don't give in, I'm going to testify against you in the death of your brother. Because his brother had died in an arson fire in 1929. But my grandfather was nowhere around it. My great uncle was, because he killed himself in the arson fire. So he's in it. And that was another urban myth I heard. So when I was my first draft of the book, I wrote it, and I sort of tried to put myself in that time, and the knowledge I had of that history of immigrants and of my relatives. So I try to do the story as I heard it, but to make it plausible. After I did the first draft, I did find a newspaper article on the arson, but they spelled Lomeo incorrectly, which is understandable. So I don't even know how I found it, but there's, I don't know, it's a 2-column about the blast. So it was a really large arson that I thought happened in McKeesport, actually, but it happened in the city of Pittsburgh. So the only person that died was my grandfather's brother. So Mungeon Dorm says, I'm going to go testify saying, because there's no statute of limitation on murder, that you were there, and unless you drop this. So he dropped the suit. And that's, so about a month, and I won't tell you more of the story because it's interesting, I want you to read it, but a month and a half later, 2 months later, my uncle, again, this could be not connected, but it sounds too coincidental for me. My uncle on Christmas Eve is killed with a hit and run. It's in the paper. He's dead. It was his son. It was Paulo's son who was with them. So my grandpa always thought that was payback. So the attorney that he went to see, he lived in D.C. So he was going to try to get help from this attorney because this attorney had some sort of connections, and he does get a little bit of help from him. But that is, to me, was that just coincidental? I mean, he settled the case. It was Christmas Eve. The person could have been drunken. But what's funny is it was a hit and run. They put the name in 1945. Yeah, December 24th, 1945. They put the name in the paper of who the person was driving the car, but he was never prosecuted. He didn't get prosecuted. I found it, and I didn't put it in the book. He didn't get prosecuted until 1966. And the reason was that they said they couldn't find him because he was in other states or in the U.S. Army. That's in the paper. I'm like, well, you couldn't find him. And then he was found not guilty. So I don't know what happened. So was that a mafia? I don't know.
Where did that accident happen, Jim?
Do you know where 5th Avenue is going to East McKeesport? There is, what's there now? It's a little, it's not all the way to the top. It's in the middle of, as you're climbing the hill. There's like a little apartment building called the Continental Arms. I think that's what, I don't know if it's still called that. So he pulled over to change a tire. So how did he get the flat tire?
Right.
I didn't put that in the book. I mean, did it and then was the guy drunk and just hit him? Or something else? But the only thing that bothered me was that he didn't get prosecuted at all. Now, I understand the hit and run. You understand why he ran. He killed somebody. He was probably drinking. He didn't want to get a more serious crime of driving under the influence and killing somebody. But you still don't prosecute him until 20 years later?
Is there no way of getting court records for that?
Yeah, I didn't look it up. You mean for the 1966 case? Yeah, I didn't. Yeah, I thought about doing it then. And
Because, I mean, if there is this question in your mind, they make a judgment on something. They make a judgment on the testimony or, you know, they'd have to make a case, right?
right.
I mean, you know better than I do, but I mean, it just seems to me that that's the kind of thing that would end up as public record.
And it probably is. I would think. I don't know, from so long ago, 50 years, how do you, I mean, I would think they still would have it. But the reason I didn't look at the record was I'm taking this story from my grandfather's viewpoint, not from, I'm trying at least to do it from his viewpoint. So this is what he thought. I'm not saying this is exactly, and that's the disclaimer I put at the beginning of the book and then in the notes, is that I'm not saying this is exactly what happened, because as an attorney, I like to make sure things are, you know, rule of law, and if you're going to say something, it's got to be confirmed. So that's why I put that disclaimer in there. But I did use his real name just because, I mean, he did kill my uncle, and he did have a trial, so I thought it was legitimate at least to say, I mean, he was found not guilty, though, too. So maybe he was not guilty. I mean, I'm not saying, because could someone influence a jury 20 years later? I don't know. Maybe not. But it makes for a good story, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
it does.
What impact did that have on your father and then on you, that background of your grandfather?
I'm not sure what it had on my father, except for he was very strong-willed and independent.
He was Sicilian.
Right. But his brother wasn't, though. His older brother wasn't. You can see from the store, I mean, from this picture, I mean, I don't know if you can, it's hard to see, but, I mean, it's not like at a fancy store, because what he's using for stands are, he puts up boxes and then puts the stand on it. So my grandfather, I mean, my uncle, the oldest son, kept the store basically the same. He was in the vehicle when his brother died. So I could never figure out, and I've sort of lost touch with his children. He's since deceased, but his children are out. And I emailed one, and I didn't get a response back. And I'm not even sure I had the right person, but.
Is your grandfather's picture in there?
Yes. I have, the Post-Gazette was kind enough. They said since it was prior to 1963, I could use these without paying for it or any, I could just use them. I didn't even need their permission. But they asked if I would say, give them courtesy, so I did. So I have, it's hard to see though. But this is, I don't know if you can really see. I don't know if it's
Can you
good.
pass it? So
Yeah, yes, that's a
Well,
good
here,
idea.
start with,
It's okay, I
Okay.
bought the book.
Oh, okay.
Are
But-
you going to talk about the attorney? What happened to the attorney?
Should I talk about what happened to the attorney? Did you get to that part?
Oh, yeah.
do you name the attorney in the book?
Yes, but again, I couldn't verify the name.
All right, well, what
But-
name did you?
James Tomasello. So that's the name I think it is.
Okay.
So, but my aunt in Sicily, I believe her married name is Tomasello, so I don't know if
Right.
somehow. So James Tomasello, after my uncle, and they bury him after the funeral, he doesn't know what to do because he thinks now they're going to come after the rest of his family. So he had, should I tell him the story?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you have to read the book too.
Yeah.
So Tomasello is the one he's the one that was sort of directing the legal case against my grandfather.
He's in Washington, D.C.
He's in D.C. He's directing the legal case, but he doesn't know it's my grandfather because everyone's calling him Paul Roma. So he doesn't even know that it's my grandfather. So he comes to Pittsburgh because it's like you're letting this little peon like mess up our whole strike, because if he wins this case, then we don't have a right to unionize anybody. So we got to win this one. So he comes to Pittsburgh, and when he's talking to the union's attorney, and I put the actual union attorney's name in the book. I couldn't verify their dialogue. Yes.
Yeah.
I couldn't verify their dialogue, so I sort of, as an attorney, I sort of figured, okay, this is what they probably said. Ben. So Mr. Jubileer says, well, I think he's going to quit. We're going to make him quit. He said, Lomeo won't bother us anymore. And he goes, well, who's Lomeo? He says, I thought we were dealing with Rome. I goes, no, that's just the name of the store. He goes, wait, I know Paul Lomeo. I can't. So he goes to the courthouse and sees my grandfather after he settles the case. And they have a nice talk. They went to across the street of the courthouse, sat down for coffee. And he was so happy to see Tomasello, because Tomasello had saved them from that court-martial. And he never had told anyone about the court-martial because he was embarrassed. Young kid, and he wasn't thinking, right? And being dumb, he did something dumb. So he thanked them. Tomasello told him the doctor didn't die. He said, you didn't know that? He goes, I didn't know that. So he comes home, and my grandmother thinks my grandpa's going to be upset, and he's happy because for all those years he thought, so it was only dollars.
Oh my God.
You know, he's only fighting over dollars now because does his Teamster get the $13 or not? But his like whole being changed. So he figures Tomasello's, to use their vernacular, connected. So Tomasello says, and in Sicilian dialect, if you say, and I think it's Spanish too probably, if you say Don, D-O-N, that's a sign of respect. So he called him Don Lomeo, and he said, well, I don't deserve that. You're an attorney. You know people. And he goes, I'll call you Don Tomasello. And he said, well, Don Lomeo, if you need something, call me, but your problem should be over. So after the accident, the hit and run, he decides he's going to call Tomasello, but he doesn't know how to get a hold of him, so he asks his McKeesport attorney. Finds out Tomasello was killed in a hit and run. So I remember, I can't confirm any of this, but this is the story that I have. So he talks to Mrs. Tomasello, and her family's connected. So she supposedly made a phone call, and her problem ceased. So then also I through the beginning of the story, I take him from Sicily. He was in a little town in Bulgaria to Palermo. He actually sailed out of France, Cherbourg, France. Yeah. So I don't know how he got into the French port of Cherbourg, but oral history had it that he came under the French quota. Do you remember the quotas?
Oh, yeah.
The quotas, for those who may not know, is the United States had quotas on what immigrants could come to the United States. So the Northern Europeans had a higher quota than the Southern Europeans. So I always had heard my grandfather came under the French quota. Well, when I looked up at the ship's manifest in Ellis Island, and this is what I try to do with the book. I try to confirm everything I heard, and if I couldn't confirm it, if it sounded plausible, I used it. But the ship manifest had him as an Italian. So I don't know how he got to Cherbourg, so I used my maternal grandfather, my grandmother, his wife, I used their story to get him from Palermo to Cherbourg. So it still gives you the immigrants' feeling, especially the Ellis Island. People think that Ellis Island is a nice place. My grandmother could not stand Ellis Island. I mean, she didn't even want to talk about it because it was not a nice experience for her. So I put that in the book. He meets a friend who changed his name so he could fit into society. So, and that's true though. That's the immigrant, not just the Italian immigrant. That's the immigrant experience. His grandfather actually was in Garibaldi's revolution. I don't know if you're familiar with Garibaldi's revolution, but that's what united Italy. Well, it started in Sicily. So he got injured in the revolution, and he always thought, a lot of the Sicilians, I don't know about today, but at least in my grandfather's generation, thought Garibaldi was something. Not my family, because Alberto did not like Garibaldi because he thought he used the Sicilians to gain fame and power because he was a northern Italian. So there was a big, I never understood why, until I started researching this book, why Italians ask you what region you're from, because they're so parochial. They don't like, my grandparents never said they were Italian, they said they were Sicilian. They never thought they were Italian. Now we say it here, and that's how you classify people, but they never said, yeah. And then I do that too. It's just a habit. I mean, someone says they're Italian, I say, "Oh, what region's your family from?" I mean, and I just like it's just because that's what I had learned. But it shows, and I think that's probably where he got his independent spirit a little bit, because his grandfather, Polo's grandfather, kept telling him, don't trust the elected officials, don't trust the political elite, because all they'll do is take from you. Remember, Sicily was a very poor country. These people were very, very poor. I think the ship's manifest said he had like $6 in his pocket or something, just like a very small amount. So that's the basis of the story. And did you finish the book yet?
I'm close.
Okay. Whoever reads the book, I'm going to talk about the coin. I want you to email me and tell me what you think happened to the coin. That's all I'm going to say. You can go to jameslomeo.com. No, no, it's an enticement.
I know now where you get your backbone, from your grandfather.
Me.
And he got it from your great-grandfather.
Right.
And your great-grandfather probably knew what he was talking about.
I think so.
Yes.
And I think some of those stories I heard, I mean, I try not to do it, but I'm sure that I put a little bit of myself, like, against the political establishment. And I mean, I just think it's, because that's what originally I had started out with the book, is just to be factual and to like do an essay. So does anyone have any questions on immigration?
About what age was your grandfather when he arrived in Ellis Island?
He would have been 22.
He wasn't married yet.
No, he was not married.
How did he meet his wife?
She, her,
Rosa, he married Rosa.
Rosalia, yeah. He met her, he was taking the train from New York, and he was stopped in Harrisburg because he was going to Pittsburgh because someone on his boat told him Pittsburgh is where they have jobs, probably because of the mills, right? So that's where he wanted to go. He didn't know where he was going. The ship's manifest said he had a contact in the United States, so he must have known at some point he was going to Pittsburgh. I think the person was like around Canonsburg. So when the train stops in Harrisburg, my grandmother's waitress at like a small deli. And so she realizes he's an immigrant, so she's nice to him. She had come to the United States early in life, so she spoke English very well. And they met, and he was lost because it's just his second day in the United States. She takes him home. My other great-grandfather's mad because you're not supposed to take a guy home. But she lived with her parents, but they fought at first, but then they became friends, and they respected each other. And some of that story also, like with the bringing home the man and going to church, I really picked that up from my other grandparents because that was their experience also. So I figured it was probably a similar experience.
His brother, when did he come? Did he come first or did he come later?
His brother came after. Now, his brother was what you would call, again, their vernacular, a wise guy. He wanted to be in the mafia. So that's how he got into trouble. He and Munjan Dorm wanted to be like the big shot. You know, he always dressed well, took half the profits out of the store because they were partners at first. And my grandfather's brother, even though his name was Eugenko, they called him Jimmy for some reason. So when Jimmy comes to the United States, he gets in with the wrong group of people, and he goes to Pittsburgh. There's a butcher who wants to commit arson so he can collect the insurance money. So, now, again, he was young. I mean, I think he was like 22. He stacks up, like, and it says, this is in the paper, he stacks up like 4 large barrels of gunpowder, gasoline, puts them in the corners, ties a knot with sheets, you know, like the wicks in the middle, and lights it. He doesn't get out, so he's dead. Munjan Dorm was too afraid. Munjan Dorm was outside, like being the lookout. And when it blew up so largely, he left. But the paper said that it was such a large explosion, it pushed a car across the street. Flying glass came out and hit a lady in the leg. She had to go to St. Margaret's Hospital, it was still around. And there wasn't supposed to be anyone in the apartment building. There was a lady in the apartment building. She got out, though. So Munjan Dorm, he had to tell my grandfather what happened. So he said, that's it, you're out of the store. So that's how he got it. Munjan Dorm was not in the store anymore. And that's the arson murder that they were going to try to pin on my grandfather. So, and this is the funniest part. I mean, it's my relative, so I can say this. The butcher gives him a check for the arson made to cash. So they find it on his body. So I'm telling Lucy and Juliet, that's my other daughter, when I read it, I'm saying, this guy wasn't too bright. I mean, if you're going to commit arson, at least get the cash. He takes a check.
But isn't it a wonderful thing that the best thing you could say is Lomeos don't make good criminals?
Yeah, right. Right. There's always one, right? So the detective in the paper says he probably took the check because if he chickened out, the butcher would have stopped paying on a check. But the check probably wasn't even any good. So through testimony, the butcher said that he was being threatened by Italians because he was going to open up a fruit market. And he thinks the Lomeos were trying to threaten him, and that's why the brother was there. But remember, his building's on Butler Street in the city of Pittsburgh, Lawrenceville, and the little fruit store, which is as big as this room, is in McKeesport. So, I mean, there would be 1,000 competitors. I mean, he's not going to. So the detective said, and then they brought up also in the paper that the week before he burned his car, the butcher burned his car and burned his house, I think. So they're like, yeah, I mean, yeah, there's a pattern here. Bad acts. Yes?
You said she hated the Ellis Island thing. Can you describe what that was all about? Or were they treated, was it the way they were treated by the officials? Or
Yeah, the officials were not nice to them. Remember, they're uneducated. They don't understand because they don't know the language. They're just coming over. And so they're not being treated fairly. And they just herd them in like cattle. So there's just, the Italians are in this section. French are in this section. And his problem was that the day he went through, according to my grandmother, was there was no Italian interpreter. So he had a French interpreter. So the French, again, right, don't like the Southern Italians either. Like the Southern Italians don't like the French. But they thought, for some reason, they thought my grandfather was from northern Italy. So they were a little more nice to him. Because he wasn't the riffraff from Sicily. And he could understand the interpreter a little bit because a lot of the French dialect, a lot of the Sicilian dialect is French. Like some of the words I used to say to my grandfather were in French, not Italian.
How long were they there in that? Did they have to stay there?
No, he didn't have to stay there. No, they didn't quarantine him or anything. I mean, he went through the process.
I mean, the usual, was it a matter of days when they were there? And then
Yeah, because yes, they would take you from.
matter of days?
They would take you from your holding place, then into the exam room. So that would probably take 3 or 4 days to get through. Sort of like what's happening now in the United States and on our southern borders. You have an influx of people. You can't just, you've got to do something with them. So you put them in a holding area, give them water and food, and then when you examine them, you take them to another area. So one of these days I'll have to visit Ellis Island, but she never said anything pleasant about it because they would use a button hook, for example, they would use a button hook to lift up their eyelids. Right, and they were worried about that the seawater would make their eyes red, so they were worried that if they looked at their eyes, they might not have had an infection, but the examiner would said you have an infection and send you back. Mm-hmm. Yes, Marv?
Do you have siblings, and did they give you information, and did you agree with them all the time, or were there debates?
Yes, I do have siblings. They're not interested in history. So, like my youngest brother, he would say, well, I'm not sure, like that happened. I don't remember it that way. So yeah, we did have a little bit of a discussion with it. But I would sit and talk to my paternal grandfather because he lived till 94. But my other siblings didn't because they weren't interested in it. But I like the old stories about. I was more interested in like what makes a. I guess they were so poor. I think I knew why. But it takes a lot. To me, it takes a lot of guts to just pick up and leave. And you don't even know the language. That's like us going to China. How would you get? How would you? But all our families have done it. It's amazing to me that people do it. But I guess when you're so poor and you want to provide a better life for yourself and your family, you'll do those things.
I thought you said that your grandfather started this business about 1929. Wasn't that when the Depression came, and wouldn't that have been a really tough time to start a business?
Well, he actually started the store in about 1922 with Munch and Dorm.
Oh, okay.
And then in March of 1929 is when the arson happened. Oh. So he asked Munch and Dorm to leave the business, and Munch and Dorm's wife wanted to be paid for the business. And he said, well, my grandmother pulled the wife aside and said, well, you're just lucky he doesn't get really mad at you for killing his brother, so I would just say, sign the papers and leave. So that's what happened. So he did have the store in 1929. Yeah, and he had, like everyone, he had a severe problem in the Depression. Right. That's why they didn't have a lot of money, as you can see from the picture on the book, is that the store it was enough to survive. Sure. I remember seeing their house when now it's not there anymore, but it was just a small little house they lived in. And it probably didn't have, I couldn't go in because they didn't own it at the time, but it was very small. I couldn't have maybe 1 or 2 bedrooms at most. Those older houses in McKeesport, it was just a frame, siding type of house. Yes?
So I really believe that you found all the necessary elements and facts to tell the story that you needed to tell. But are there still things you want to know? I was born in McKeesport. I'm going to call my people and be like, do you ever hear of Munch and Dorm? Because, I'm curious. Do you know what I mean? Are you...
Well, I'm
found out what you wanted to find out?
Yeah, I did because when he settled the case, he had his attorney read, because he didn't speak English well, so he had his attorney read into the record a statement, and he said, I can't get any help. I can't get protection from the police, the courts. Same thing with the editorial said. He said, and I'm done being a prophet in the wilderness. So to me, that was like, it said a lot.
Wow.
Mhm.
Okay.
Mhm. So I think after a while, there's only so much a person can take. And I didn't look up, like we have an Italian mafia figure in McKeesport, Joey the Dime. So I don't know who Joey the Dime is. I don't know who Munch and Dorm is either, but I've heard the term. And the story I heard is Munch and Dorm was his business partner. But the reason I didn't look it up is, was Munch and Dorm truly his business partner? Yeah, I don't know. And I heard the story that Munch and Dorm came to him and gave him this, like, I'm going to testify against you.
Jim, that is really well written.
Oh, do you think so?
You are an excellent writer.
Oh, I see. I was so worried about it.
I'm telling you, I couldn't put the book down.
No, I'm glad to hear it, because I was so worried about it.
It really held my interest, yeah.
Oh, I'm glad. I'm glad.
Yeah, and I've benefited by it.
Oh, I'm glad.
So, you're a good writer.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
I-
It's hard. It's a difficult skill for me, so
Okay.
over the years I've been I've tried to get better and
You
better.
could write a book on Monroe.
I could. And should I use some of the real names?
I'll buy the book.
Okay. As long as it's true, I could put it in the book. I think I could get a couple good stories out of it.
Is it self-published or did you?
Yes, I self-published it.
How did you do that?
That's an interesting process. Does everyone know what self-publishing is?
Yes.
Okay. So when I was writing the book, I thought I didn't really understand what self-publishing was. So I learned the process, and to go to a publishing house, you have to have an agent.
No.
No?
No.
Oh, I thought you did.
No.
Depends on which one.
It does depend on a particular publishing house. But there are a lot of publishing houses that will publish a memoir, for example, and are not looking for an agent. They prefer not to. University presses would be another place that might pick up something like that.
Oh, that's interesting.
And there's still the possibility that it could.
Yeah, because that would help.
University press that would publish it.
Yeah, that definitely would help.
So what's your?
So once I learned I could self-publish, then I decided I wanted to do it the right way, because a lot of the self-published books are sort of not paying attention to the quality. So I asked the Trib to review the book, and he said, we don't review self-published books. He didn't say it directly, but I understood what he meant. He was trying to be nice, but like, he's not sure of the quality if it doesn't come through a legitimate publishing house. And I completely understand that, because they're running a business. So what I wanted to do was make sure it was as good as possible. I hired an editor from Pittsburgh to edit the book. And then I didn't accept all their edits, though, because it's my story, so she would change the phrases or the punch. And I like that punch sometimes, so I kept it. But you forget a comma, you forget an ED, you forget the. So that helped a lot. And then I went through it, did some more changes on my own. Then I hired a second editor. And there's this website called Elance. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Elance, Freelance, Elance. So you could put any proposal you want on this site, so editors included. So I did, and I guess it's hit and miss, but I tried to find someone I thought was qualified. So I sent it to her. She was in Texas for a second edit, and she came back with some changes. But they all missed things, too. Like right before I published it, I caught 2 misspelled words. I mean, again, it's my fault because I typed it, but they didn't catch it either. And then after I sent it to be self-published on Amazon, they do their own spell check and caught 2. So, yeah, and I'll explain more of it, but it goes really well into this. Formatting the pages was to me the most difficult thing, because you have to block these pages and make them look a certain way. Well, I didn't realize that. So the first time I got a proof, it was just like sentences everywhere. So then I realized, okay, I got to format the pages. When they formatted the pages, they would take out paragraphs, take out words, and I would have to read this thing all over again. And I must have read the book 8 times because you forgot this word, you forgot this. So that was, and then this is, the cover is, I really like the cover, I have to say. You could judge this book by its cover if you want to. Because this is an actual photograph from the Post-Gazette, or the Press, I guess, Pittsburgh Press, 1945. And I found a graphic designer on Elance. Purely by coincidence, she lives in the same hometown where my wife grew up. So it's sort of interesting. But I told her I want this picture no matter what. And then this is a back picture of, the back picture is of McKeesport. And I took this off the internet. Looking at the cars, it's probably 1948, 49. So it's close enough, not exactly. So what she did is, I don't know if you can see, but she took the picture that I took off the internet and wrapped it around and then put the picture I wanted on top. So that it has that look. And then she came up with the colors, the red colors, and the black and the border. Or the bind, I guess they call it. And I came up with the title From the Ice to the Fire. Remember I had told you yeah, exactly. Remember I had told you when the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette reporter called me when I was running for mayor. He said, there's 10 days in October where your grandfather's on page 1. So at first, I was going to name it the book 10 Days in October. But then that sounded too cliche because there's a movie, 5 Days in May? Then one of the pictures, I only put 3 pictures in, but one of the pictures has him pushing his cart through the Teamsters. And you could, it's just a still picture, of course, but you can imagine what they were saying to him as he was pushing through them. And it said, from the ice to the fire. And then it explains that he's taking his peaches and plums out of the cold storage and into this hot environment. So I thought that summed it up pretty well. So that's how I came up with the title. Well,
You put a lot of years into this
2.5.
and money, and I hope you break even.
I need to sell 600 books to break even.
Okay.
So
Is it also available for Kindle?
it is.
Oh, cool.
Mhm.
For Kindle, it's available for Kindle.
Yeah, so I can't sell it through myself, but it's on Amazon and it's on Kindle. Obviously, if it's through myself, and there's no shipping or those type of things. But it's easier maybe with Amazon sometimes. And if you have a Kindle, it's the easiest.
Do you have an Amazon Marketplace account? Because that way you could at least get 4 to 6% when people click through your link to buy it.
No, I didn't know about that.
Yeah, I do that.
Oh, do you?
And it helps pay for my website, you see.
Well, that's good.
So I'll catch you later.
Oh, that would be wonderful. Yeah, so it's also a lot of marketing for a book, right? Because there's so many books out. Which ones do you want to read? I always have that problem too. And the funny thing is, that's why I was really concerned about writing this book, is because I wanted to do a nonfiction book. But as I was talking to Lucy, as I was writing it, I'm thinking, well, this character I'm not really sure about. And she's like, Dad, you can't call it nonfiction if you don't know. So it's classified as historical fiction, and I think that's the right classification because the dialogue, I don't know. I don't really know if Munch and Dorm said those things or was the partner. I tried to verify it, I couldn't. So to be fair to everyone, I think it's the best to classify it that way.
Did you have the final say then on all the editing that went on? Sometimes I take liberties.
Yes.
Okay.
And I got antsy. I could have waited, I guess, and tried to find a publishing house or find an agent. But then I got antsy after 2.5 years, and I thought, well, I just want to get this out. And I was afraid if I went through a publishing house, they would dictate to me, and I didn't want them to change my story. Do you think this would be a good movie?
Has anybody approached you?
I'm trying to find somebody, but
I can tell you, she does.
I
so
thought of that when I was reading it. This would make a good movie. There's been mafia movies in the past.
but I would be afraid. I would be afraid that they would. I don't want them to change the story, though.
I don't want to come to my house.
I'm sorry.
I don't want to come to our house.
Yeah, right.
Historically, though, that's important about Pittsburgh and the unions and the immigrants and all of that. So that's a good history lesson as well as being interesting.
And it's more has to do with, because he wasn't against the union per se, but even the people that were striking the store. The story I heard from both my grandfather, my mother's father, and my father was that he invited the picketers into his store, like, for a cup of coffee. I mean, he wasn't like that mad with them because he understood that he had to cooperate with people. But sometimes I think things get out of hand, and maybe the higher ups aren't really looking out for the rank and file sometimes.
On the Kindle edition, I saw that you have some pictures there. Do the pictures on the Kindle, do they show up well?
I think so. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I was only able to test the Kindle. They let you test it before you publish it, and all the pictures showed up.
Okay. Okay.
Any other questions before we end this evening?
I'll remind everybody who loves it to post a review on Amazon.
Oh,
because
thank you.
That's one of the biggest things we can do to help authors.
Thank you. And remember, if you read the book, let me know what happens to the coin. Thank you. I appreciate it.